May 27, 1940. The port of Dunkirk, France. Private James Edward Fletcher of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, climbed into the last evacuating vessel as German artillery shells exploded along the waterfront, leaving behind his rifle, his pack, and a small photograph of his wife Margaret and their 4-year-old daughter Sarah that he'd kept folded in his breast pocket since mobilization 8 months earlier. The photograph was gone. Blown away when shrapnel from a Stuka dive bomber had torn through his uniform jacket near Wormhout, 3 days before the evacuation. Fletcher had searched for it in the mud and blood, on his hands and knees while machine gun fire tore through the air above him. The photograph had been his talisman. The only thing connecting him to the life he'd left behind in Norwich. Sarah's face, age 4, smiling at the camera. Margaret standing behind her, hand on their daughter's shoulder. The photo had been taken in their back garden on a Sunday afternoon in March 1939, 3 weeks before mobilization. Flowers were blooming. The sun was shining. War was coming but had not yet arrived. Now the photograph was gone. Somewhere in the blood-soaked earth of Wormhout, pressed into mud among shell casings and bodies. Fletcher had searched for 20 minutes before another soldier pulled him away, told him the Germans were coming, told him to move or die there. He boarded the ship without it. Without the faces he'd memorized. Without proof that his family existed beyond memory. The vessel pulled away from Dunkirk at 1745 hours. Behind them, the town burned. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the evening sky. The harbor was choked with wrecked ships, sunken boats, abandoned equipment. Bodies floated in the water. Fletcher stood at the rail and watched France disappear into the haze. He was one of the fortunate ones. Nearly 200 men from his battalion had not made it to the beaches. They were dead, captured, or missing. Fletcher was alive, heading home to England, to his family in Norwich. He calculated the journey time. 12 hours across the channel, then trains north. He could be home by tomorrow evening. Could hold Sarah, could see Margaret's face, could sleep in his own bed. The ship never reached England. At 2,130 hours, a German E-boat squadron intercepted the vessel 6 miles off the English coast. Torpedo boats, fast and deadly. They emerged from darkness without warning. The first torpedo struck the engine room. The explosion killed 23 crewmen instantly and crippled the ship's propulsion. The second torpedo hit near the bow. Water rushed into the forward holds. The vessel began listing to starboard. Soldiers scrambled for lifeboats, but there were only 4 boats for 600 men. Panic spread through the crowded decks. Fletcher helped launch one of the boats. Pushed younger soldiers toward it, told them to row for England, told them to keep going no matter what. The boat was lowered into black water. 18 men climbed in. Fletcher was not among them. At 21:48, the ship went down. The bow dipped beneath the surface, then the stern lifted vertical, propellers spinning in air. Men slid down the deck into the sea. Some wore life jackets. Most did not. Fletcher jumped before the ship rolled completely over. The water was 54 degrees. Cold enough to kill in 15 minutes. Fletcher swam away from the sinking vessel, away from the undertow, away from the men screaming in the darkness. His uniform was heavy, soaked, dragging him down. He stripped off his jacket, kicked off his boots, kept moving. A German E-boat appeared beside him. Searchlight swept across the water, found his face. Hands reached down, pulled him from the sea. He was dragged onto the deck, pushed down beside other survivors. 23 British soldiers, shivering, bleeding, vomiting seawater. The E-boat commander spoke in broken English. Told them they were prisoners of war. Told them the war was over for them. Told them they were fortunate to be alive. Fletcher said nothing. He watched England fade into the night behind him as the E-boat turned east, heading back toward occupied France. In Norwich, Margaret Fletcher received the telegram on June 3, 1940. She read it standing in the doorway of their small terraced house on BR Street while Sarah played with wooden blocks on the parlor floor, unaware that her father had been lost at sea during the Dunkirk evacuation. The telegram was brief. Regretted to inform. Missing, presumed dead. Further information would follow. No further information followed. Margaret kept the telegram in a drawer in her bedroom. Did not read it again. Did not need to. The words were memorized. She told Sarah that Daddy was away, that he would come home when he could, that she needed to be a good girl and wait patiently. Sarah was 4 years old. She asked about her father every day for 3 months, then every week, then every month. By her 5th birthday, she stopped asking. The memories were fading. His face became unclear. His voice became a sound she could not quite recall. Margaret worked at a munitions factory. 12-hour shifts, 6 days per week. Sarah stayed with Margaret's mother during work hours. At night, Margaret came home exhausted, made dinner from ration coupons, put Sarah to bed, sat alone in the parlor listening to BBC broadcasts about the war. The war continued. France fell. The Battle of Britain began. German bombers struck British cities. Norwich was hit in April 1942. Incendiary bombs destroyed 240 buildings. Margaret and Sarah spent the night in a public shelter, pressed against strangers in the darkness while explosions shook the earth above them. They survived. Their house was intact. The factory where Margaret worked was damaged but operational. Life continued. By 1943, Sarah was 7 years old. She attended school, learned to read and write, played with neighborhood children who also had fathers away at war. Some fathers were serving overseas. Some were dead. Some were missing. The distinctions mattered to adults but meant little to children. Sarah drew pictures of her family in school. Mother, grandmother, herself. No father. When asked about it, she said he was gone. The teacher did not press further. In September 1944, Margaret received another telegram. This one was different. From the Red Cross. They had located a James Edward Fletcher in a German prisoner of war camp in Poland. The camp was Stalag XXA near Tarynia. Fletcher had been there since June 1940. He was alive. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table and read the telegram 5 times. Sarah was at school. The house was quiet. She set the telegram on the table, placed her hands flat on either side of it, and cried for 20 minutes without making a sound. When Sarah came home, Margaret told her that her father was alive. That he was in a prison camp in Poland. That he would come home when the war ended. Sarah asked what Poland was. Margaret showed her on a map. Sarah asked when the war would end. Margaret said soon. She hoped it was true. January 20th, 1945. Stalag XXA, near Tarynia, Poland. The temperature was 12 degrees below zero. Private James Edward Fletcher stood in the assembly yard with 3,700 other British and Commonwealth prisoners while German guards shouted orders and Soviet artillery rumbled in the distance, 60 miles to the east. The Russians were coming. The German guards knew it. The prisoners knew it. Liberation was approaching, but the Germans were not going to leave the prisoners behind to be freed. They were going to march them west, away from the advancing Red Army, deeper into German territory. Fletcher had been a prisoner for 4 years and 7 months. Stalag XXA held over 10,000 prisoners at its peak, mostly British and French captured at Dunkirk, living in wooden barracks that leaked in rain and offered no protection from Polish winter wind. In that time Fletcher had lost 48 pounds from a body that had started at 180, survived 2 bouts of pneumonia that killed weaker men in the bunks around him, lived through winters where temperatures reached 30 below zero and summers where heat and disease swept through the barracks killing dozens. He had watched 127 men from his camp die. Some from disease, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. Some from starvation. Some from beatings. Some simply gave up, stopped eating, stopped moving, lay down in their bunks and did not wake up. The daily routine had become mechanical. Wake at 0530. Roll call at 0600, standing in formation for hours while German guards counted and recounted. Breakfast at 0800, thin soup, sometimes with bits of turnip, occasionally with small pieces of potato. Work details at 0900. Fletcher had worked in a stone quarry for 2 years, breaking rocks 12 hours per day. His hands became calloused, then scarred. His back became permanently bent from the labor. In 1943 he was transferred to agricultural work, less brutal but still exhausting. Planting potatoes, harvesting grain, feeding animals that ate better than the prisoners. Lunch was at 1,300, more soup, sometimes with bread so hard it had to be soaked before eating. Evening roll call at 1800. Dinner at 1900, the same thin soup. Lights out at 2200. Sleep on wooden bunks with thin blankets that provided no warmth. Men shared blankets, huddled together for survival. Some died in the night from cold, their bodies not discovered until morning roll call. Fletcher survived by following rules. Do not anger guards. Do not resist. Keep your head down. Share food when possible. Help others when you can without drawing attention. He formed quiet friendships with men in his barracks. Shared stories about home. About families. About lives that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. He weighed 132 pounds now. His uniform, the same one issued at capture, hung loose on his frame. Ribs visible through skin. Arms thin as branches. His teeth were loose in his gums from scurvy, the vitamin deficiency that plagued prisoners living on soup and bread. He had lost 2 molars already. Chewing was difficult. His gums bled constantly. He had not heard from his family since capture. The Geneva Convention required captors to allow prisoners to send and receive mail, but the Germans were selective about implementation. Some prisoners received letters regularly. Fletcher received none. Did not know if Margaret had been notified of his capture. Did not know if letters from home had been lost, destroyed, or simply never sent. Did not know if his family was alive. The Blitz had destroyed parts of Norwich in 1942. He'd heard about it from other prisoners who received news from home. Margaret and Sarah could be dead. He had no way to know. The march began at 0630 hours. Guards formed the prisoners into columns of 5 men across. Told them they would walk until ordered to stop. Gave no destination. Fletcher carried a blanket, a cup, and a small canvas bag containing 3 pieces of black bread and a photograph he'd bartered for in 1942. The photograph was not of his family. It was of someone else's family. But he kept it anyway. Reminded him that families existed somewhere beyond the wire. The column moved west through snow-covered fields. The pace was brutal. Men who fell were shot. Men who could not walk fast enough were shot. The guards were nervous, scanning the eastern horizon constantly, listening for artillery. On the second day, a prisoner from Fletcher's barracks collapsed. German shepherd named Robert Clark, 24 years old, captured at Dunkirk the same night as Fletcher. Clark had dysentery. Could not keep food down. Could barely walk. Fletcher and 2 other men half-carried Clark for 3 miles. The guards noticed. Shouted at them to let him fall. Fletcher ignored the order. Kept moving. After another mile, Clark died. They left his body beside the road. The march lasted 86 days. The longest 86 days of Fletcher's life. The column walked through Poland, through Pomerania, through Mecklenburg, across frozen fields and through destroyed towns, following roads clogged with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. They walked an average of 15 miles per day. On good days, when roads were clear and weather permitted, they made 20. On bad days, when snow fell heavily or roads became impassable, they made 5. But they always made forward progress. Always west. Always away from liberation. They slept in barns when they found them. In abandoned buildings when available. In open fields when nothing else existed. Fletcher learned to sleep standing up, leaning against other prisoners for warmth and support. Learned to keep moving even when exhaustion threatened to collapse his legs. Learned to distinguish between pain that meant danger and pain that simply meant alive. Food was scarce. The Germans had minimal supplies for themselves and none to spare for prisoners. Fletcher and other men scavenged. 8 frozen potatoes found in abandoned fields. 8 raw grain stolen from barns. 8 anything that could be swallowed. Some men ate grass. Some ate tree bark. Some ate nothing and died. Water was easier to obtain. Snow could be melted, streams could be drunk from when they weren't frozen solid. But contaminated water brought dysentery, and dysentery killed. Fletcher watched men die from it within days. Watched them lose control of their bowels, become dehydrated, collapse by the roadside. The guards did not stop the column for dying men. Did not allow others to help them. Men who fell were left behind. Some were shot. Most were simply abandoned. Hundreds of prisoners died during the march. Bodies lined the route. Fletcher stopped counting after the first month. Stopped looking at faces. Stopped learning names. Men died and the column kept moving. That was the reality. That was survival. Fletcher and 2 other men had formed a small group for mutual support. Private Robert Clark, captured at Dunkirk. Lance Corporal Thomas Warren, captured in North Africa. The 3 men walked together, slept together, shared what little food they found. When one faltered, the others helped. When one fell, the others pulled him up. On the second day, Clark collapsed. German shepherd named Robert Clark, 24 years old, from Manchester, captured at Dunkirk the same night as Fletcher. Clark had dysentery. Could not keep food down. Could barely walk. His legs buckled every few hundred yards. Fletcher and Warren half carried him. One on each side, Clark's arms over their shoulders, his feet dragging in the snow. The guards noticed. Shouted at them to let him fall. Threatened to shoot all 3. Fletcher ignored the order. Kept moving. Warren did the same. They carried Clark for 3 miles. His weight grew heavier as their strength faded. Fletcher's legs burned with effort. His breath came in gasps. But he did not let go. After another mile, Clark whispered, "Leave me." Fletcher said, "No." Clark said, "I'm dead anyway. Save yourselves." Warren said, "Shut up and walk." Clark tried. For another 100 yards. Then his body went limp. No warning. Just collapse. Fletcher and Warren lowered him to the ground. Checked for breath. Found none. Clark was dead. Died while being carried by men who refused to abandon him. They left his body beside the road. Joined the column. Kept walking. That night, Warren said, "We tried." Fletcher said, "Yes." Warren said, "It wasn't enough." Fletcher said, "It never is." The march continued. Day after day. Week after week. Winter turned to early spring but brought no warmth. Rain fell instead of snow, turning roads to mud that sucked at their feet. Fletcher's boots fell apart. He wrapped cloth around his feet, kept walking. Developed infections. Ignored them. Kept walking. In March, 20 prisoners attempted escape. Slipped away from the column during a rest stop, ran into nearby woods. Guards pursued. Found them within hours. Brought them back to the road. Shot all 20 in front of the column. Left the bodies as warning. Fletcher watched. Felt nothing. Emotion was a luxury he could not afford. Warren died in early April. Not from bullets or dysentery. From exhaustion. Simply stopped walking. Sat down by the roadside. Told Fletcher he couldn't go on. Fletcher tried to pull him up. Warren resisted. Said his legs wouldn't work anymore. Said he was finished. Fletcher said, "Get up." Warren said, "Can't." Fletcher said, "The Americans are close. Liberation is days away. Get up." Warren smiled. Said, "Tell my wife I tried." He died sitting against a fence post, smiling, while the column moved on without him. Fletcher walked on alone. The last survivor of his small group. Survived by becoming mechanical. No emotion. No thought beyond the next step. One foot forward. Then the other. Repeat. Continue. Survive. In April, the column was liberated by American forces near Lubeck. Fletcher weighed 117 pounds. His feet were infected. His lungs were damaged. But he was alive. The Americans gave them food, medical care, clean clothes. Told them they would be repatriated to Britain soon. Fletcher asked how soon. The Americans said weeks, possibly months. There were millions of displaced people in Europe. Processing took time. Fletcher waited. 2 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. He was transferred to a displaced persons camp in northern Germany. The camp held 15,000 people. British soldiers, French civilians, Polish refugees, Russian former POWs, all waiting to go home. June 12, 1945. Margaret Fletcher stood in the assembly hall of the Salvation Army building in Norwich, watching 73 children file through the main doors while volunteers handed each child a small British flag and directed them toward rows of wooden benches facing a makeshift stage at the front of the room. Sarah was among them. She was 9 years old now, taller than Margaret remembered from just that morning, wearing her school dress and holding the small flag with both hands. She found a seat in the third row, between two other girls from her class. Margaret watched from the back of the hall, standing with other mothers and volunteers. The program was called Welcome Home the Heroes. Local children would perform songs and recitations for repatriated prisoners of war who were being housed temporarily at a British Army facility outside Norwich before final discharge. The children had practiced for 2 weeks. Sarah had a solo line in one of the songs. Margaret had not told Sarah that her father might be among the prisoners. Had not wanted to raise hopes. The Red Cross letter had been vague. James Fletcher was alive, was in Britain, was in the repatriation system. But where exactly, and when he would arrive home, remained unclear. At 1,415 hours, the prisoners entered. 47 men in British Army uniforms that did not fit properly, walking in loose formation through a side door. They looked uncertain, uncomfortable, blinking in the light from the tall windows. Some smiled at the children. Others stared at the floor. Margaret scanned their faces. Did not recognize anyone. The men were thin, gaunt, older than they should have been. Some had gray hair. Some limped. They took seats on folding chairs arranged along the wall. Sarah and the other children began singing. "There'll always be an England." Their voices were young and clear. Some of the prisoners looked at the children. Others looked at their hands. Margaret kept watching the men's faces. And then she saw him. Third row, fourth from the left. He was looking at the children, and his face was different, thinner, harder, older, but she knew him. The way he held his head. The shape of his jaw. The way his left eye was slightly narrower than his right. James. Her husband. Sarah's father. Margaret's breath caught. She wanted to call out, to run to him, but the children were still singing. She stood frozen, watching him watch the children, and he had no idea she was there. The song ended. Another began. "It's a long way to Tipperary." The children swayed slightly as they sang, small flags moving in rhythm. Sarah's solo line was coming. Margaret watched James, waiting to see if he would notice his daughter. Sarah stepped forward. Her voice rose above the others, "Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square." She sang clearly, confidently. And James Fletcher looked directly at her. He did not recognize her. How could he? She had been 4. Now she was 9. Her face was different. Her hair was longer. She was a stranger to him. But Sarah looked at the men sitting along the wall. And her eyes stopped on one face. Third row, fourth from the left. She faltered mid-word. Her voice dropped. She stared at him. The other children kept singing. Sarah stood frozen, staring at a thin man in an ill-fitting uniform who stared back at her with confusion on his face. Margaret saw it happen. Saw recognition move across Sarah's face like light through water. Saw understanding replace confusion. Saw her daughter's mouth form a word without sound, "Daddy." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She kept staring. The song continued around her. James Fletcher's expression changed. Confusion became something else. Disbelief. He was looking at a 9-year-old girl he did not know, who was staring at him with tears running down her face, and somehow in that moment he understood. He stood up. The chair scraped behind him. Other prisoners looked at him. Margaret started moving toward the front of the room. The children stopped singing. Everyone was looking at James Fletcher and the small girl standing alone on the stage. Sarah said, "Daddy," out loud this time. Her voice was small and clear in the suddenly silent room. James took a step forward. Then another. He was moving toward the stage. Sarah jumped down, ran toward him. Margaret ran too. They met in the middle of the room. James dropped to his knees and Sarah collided with him. Margaret wrapped her arms around both of them. The three of them held each other in the center of the assembly hall while 73 children and 46 other prisoners and 24 volunteers watched in silence. No one spoke. James was crying. Margaret was crying. Sarah was crying. They held each other and the world narrowed to just that moment, just that embrace, just the three of them together for the first time in 5 years. After a long time, someone began clapping. Slow applause from the back of the room. Others joined. The sound built until everyone was clapping, standing, applauding the reunion they had just witnessed. But the Fletchers did not hear it. They were somewhere else, somewhere private, somewhere that war and separation and loss could not reach. The walk from the Salvation Army Hall to Br Street took 12 minutes. James, Margaret, and Sarah walked in silence. James held Sarah's hand. Margaret walked beside them, watching her husband, watching her daughter, still not quite believing they were together. Sarah looked up at her father constantly. Studied his face. She had questions. Margaret could see them forming. But Sarah did not ask them. Just walked and held his hand and looked at him. When they reached the house, James stopped at the front gate. Margaret unlocked it, pushed it open, waited. James stood looking at the door, at the windows, at the small front garden that Margaret had maintained through the war years. He said, "It looks the same." Margaret said, "Inside is different. Furniture is mostly gone. Sold it for rations." James nodded. Said, "Doesn't matter." They went inside. The parlor was indeed sparse. One sofa, one chair, a table, 2 lamps. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of James in uniform, taken in 1939 before mobilization. He looked at it. Said nothing. Sarah led him to the kitchen. Showed him where she did her homework at the table. Showed him the pantry where Margaret kept their ration books. Showed him the back garden where Margaret grew vegetables. James listened to everything Sarah said. Nodded at appropriate moments. But his face remained expressionless, distant. Margaret recognized it. She had seen it on other repatriated men. The ability to be present physically while remaining absent mentally. That night, Margaret made dinner. Potatoes, carrots, a small piece of meat from the butcher that she'd saved for the end of the week. They ate at the kitchen table. Sarah talked about school, about her friends, about the bombing in 1942. James ate slowly, chewing carefully, as if remembering how. After dinner, Margaret put Sarah to bed. Told her that Daddy needed rest, that they would talk more tomorrow. Sarah hugged her father goodnight. He hugged back carefully, as if afraid she might break. When Sarah was asleep, Margaret and James sat in the parlor. The silence between them was vast. Margaret did not know how to cross it. Did not know what to say to this man who looked like her husband but felt like a stranger. Finally James spoke. He said, "She doesn't remember me." Margaret said, "She was 4. She's 9 now. She wouldn't have recognized me if I hadn't been in that room. But she did recognize you." James shook his head. "She recognized a ghost. I saw it in her face. She was looking for someone who doesn't exist anymore." Margaret did not argue. She knew he was right. The James Fletcher who left in 1939 was gone. The man sitting beside her was someone different. Thinner, harder, haunted. But he was still her husband. Still Sarah's father. She said, "We have time. You're home now." James said, "I don't know if I know how to be home." That honesty broke something open between them. Margaret reached for his hand. He let her take it. They sat in the dim parlor, holding hands, not speaking, while the house settled around them. The first weeks were difficult. James could not sleep in the bedroom. Too enclosed. Too quiet. He slept on the sofa in the parlor, woke every 2 hours, walked through the house checking doors and windows. He could not eat full meals. His stomach had shrunk during the prison years. Margaret served him small portions. He ate slowly, mechanically. Sometimes he stopped mid-meal and stared at nothing for minutes at a time. Sarah tried to connect with him. Showed him her schoolwork, her drawings, her books. James looked at everything she showed him. Nodded. Said, "That's very good." But his eyes remained distant. Margaret watched them both. Watched her daughter try to reach a father who was present but not there. Watched her husband struggle to exist in a world that no longer made sense to him. In July, James started having nightmares. Screamed in his sleep. Woke the house. Sarah came downstairs once and found him sitting on the floor in the parlor, shaking, sweat soaking through his shirt. She stood in the doorway, watching him. Margaret appeared behind her, guided her back to bed. The next morning at breakfast, Sarah asked what was wrong with Daddy. James said, "Nothing. Bad dreams. Nothing to worry about." Sarah said, "About the war?" James said, "Yes." Sarah said, "You don't have to fight anymore. The war is over." James looked at his daughter. Really looked at her for the first time since coming home. He said, "I know. Sometimes it takes a while to remember that." That conversation was a turning point. Small, but significant. James began talking to Sarah. Not about the war. About other things. About her school. Her friends. What she wanted to be when she grew up. Sarah wanted to be a teacher. James asked why. She said because her teacher was nice and teachers helped people learn things. James said that was a good reason. They started taking walks together. Short ones at first. Around the block. To the park. James walked slowly, stopping often to rest. Sarah matched his pace. Did not rush him. They did not talk much during these walks. Just walked together, father and daughter, rebuilding something that had been broken. Margaret watched from the window sometimes. Watched them walk away down Br Street, two figures getting smaller as they moved toward the end of the road. She felt something ease in her chest. They were finding each other. Slowly. But finding each other. August 1945. James was sitting in the parlor when Sarah came home from school. She had something in her hand. A piece of paper, folded. She said, "We did art today. Drew our families." James said, "Can I see?" Sarah unfolded the paper. The drawing showed three figures. A woman, a man, a girl. All standing together, holding hands. The woman wore a blue dress. The man wore a uniform. The girl wore a red dress. James looked at the drawing for a long time. Finally he said, "This is very good." Sarah said, "That's us. You, Mummy, me." James nodded. He kept looking at the drawing. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded photograph. The one he'd carried through the war. The one that was not of his own family. He said, "I had a photograph of you. Of you and your mother. I carried it with me when the war started. But I lost it in France, before Dunkirk. I looked for it but couldn't find it. I kept this other photograph instead. It's not of us. It's of another family. But I looked at it sometimes and pretended it was." He handed the photograph to Sarah. She looked at it. A woman, a man, two children. Strangers. Sarah said, "Why did you pretend?" James said, "Because I needed to remember that families were real. That somewhere, people were living normal lives. That I had a family waiting for me." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't need to pretend anymore." James looked at his daughter. He said, "No. I don't." Sarah handed him her drawing. She said, "You can keep this instead. It's real." James took the drawing. Folded it carefully. Put it in his pocket where the old photograph had been. He said, "Thank you." That night, Margaret found the drawing on the mantelpiece in the parlor. James had unfolded it, smoothed it flat, placed it where he could see it. The photograph of strangers was gone. In its place was a child's drawing of a family that actually existed. By September 1945, James Fletcher had been home for 3 months. He had gained 14 pounds. The nightmares were less frequent. He still woke at night sometimes, still checked the doors and windows, but the panic attacks had stopped. He found work at a factory. Light assembly work. The manager was understanding, knew James was a repatriated POW, gave him breaks when he needed them. The pay was modest but steady. Sarah returned to school for the new term. She wrote an essay for her teacher titled, My Summer Holiday. She described her father coming home, their walks together, the drawings she had made. The teacher read it aloud to the class. Other children whose fathers were still overseas listened with envy and hope. In October, James attended a reunion of Dunkirk survivors at a pub in Norwich. 17 men were there. They did not talk about the evacuation, or the prison camps, or the war. They talked about ordinary things. Jobs. Families. The weather. After an hour, James left. Came home to Margaret and Sarah. Margaret asked how it went. James said, it was good to see them. But I'd rather be here. Years passed. The war became history. James and Margaret had 2 more children. Sarah grew up, became a teacher as she'd wanted. James worked at the factory until retirement. The nightmares faded but never disappeared completely. In 1965, Sarah visited a school with her father for a career day presentation. She was 29 years old, teaching at a primary school in Norwich. The children asked James about the war. He answered their questions simply. Yes, he had been a soldier. Yes, he had been captured. Yes, it had been difficult. One child asked if he had been scared. James said yes, he had been scared often. The child asked how he stayed brave. James looked at Sarah. He said, I thought about my family. I knew I had to get home to them. After the presentation, Sarah and James walked to their car. Sarah said, do you remember the day you came home? The assembly hall. The children singing. James said, every detail. Sarah said, I wasn't sure it was you at first. You looked different. But then I knew. I don't know how. I just knew. James said, I didn't recognize you. You were too old. But when you said my name, when you called me Daddy, something broke open inside me. It was the first time in 5 years that anyone had called me that. They stood beside the car. Sarah said, I kept that drawing. The one I made for you. I have it framed in my house. James said, I looked at it every day for years. It reminded me that we were real. That we had survived. James Fletcher died in 1987 at the age of 72. He had lived 42 years after coming home from the war. 42 years with Margaret, with Sarah, with the children who came after. 42 years of ordinary life, unremarkable and precious. At his funeral, Sarah spoke. She was 51 years old, standing before a church full of people, looking at her father's coffin covered with a British flag. She said that her father had taught her about endurance. About surviving. About coming home. She said that recognition was a miracle. That in that assembly hall in 1945, among strangers and songs and flags, 2 people who barely knew each other had found their way back to being father and daughter. She said it had taken years to fully rebuild what the war had broken, but they had done it. She said that wars steal time. 5 years of her childhood, 5 years of her father's life, 5 years that could never be returned. But what remained after the war was stronger than what was lost. Connection survived. Family survived. Love survived. Margaret Fletcher died in 1994, 7 years after her husband. She was buried beside him in a cemetery in Norwich. The headstone listed both names, both dates, and a simple inscription, together again. Sarah kept the drawing. The child's picture of a family, folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn thin. She kept it in a frame on her wall. Showed it to her own children, told them the story of the day her father came home. The story became family history. Passed down. Sarah's children told it to their children. The details remained clear. The assembly hall. The song. The recognition. The moment a 9-year-old girl saw through 5 years of war and separation and recognized the father she had nearly forgotten. Recognition was not automatic. It was an act of faith. A choice to believe that beneath the changes, beneath the trauma, beneath the time and distance, the essential person remained. Sarah had chosen to believe it. James had chosen to believe it. Margaret had chosen to believe it. And they had been right. In 2015, a researcher working on a book about child experiences during World War II interviewed Sarah. She was 79 years old. She described the reunion in detail, remembered every moment as if it had happened yesterday rather than 70 years ago. The researcher asked if the reunion had been difficult afterward. Sarah said yes. Said her father had struggled. Said he had been a stranger at first. But said they had found each other slowly, carefully, patiently. She said the key was not giving up. Not expecting everything to be perfect immediately. Understanding that healing took time, that connection had to be rebuilt, that love was not automatic but required effort and faith and perseverance. The researcher asked what Sarah wanted people to remember about her father. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Finally she said, "He survived. He came home. That's what I want people to remember. Not the suffering. Not the trauma. The survival. The return. The life he built after." The interview ended. Sarah sat in her living room, looking at the framed drawing on the wall. The child's picture of a family, drawn in 1945 by a 9-year-old girl who had just recognized her father after 5 years of separation. The paper was yellowed now. The colors had faded. But the 3 figures were still clear. Mother, father, daughter. Standing together. Holding hands. A family that war had separated but could not destroy. A family that had found each other again. A family that had survived. And in that survival, in that recognition, in that refusal to be broken, was everything that mattered.